Hello everyone, you're watching Ukraine Breaking News. My name is Maria Kahal, and today we're speaking with Daniel Vaynshteyn, an advocacy associate at Razom organization, and a person who actively works to ensure that Ukrainian voice is heard on Capitol Hill. He also worked as a legislative director for Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, and today we will discuss advocacy for Ukraine, how to persuade skeptics among Republicans, and also what the future holds for Ukraine in the context of US politics. Daniel, thank you for taking the time for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Maria, and what an important and critical time it is for us to be having this discussion today.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask, was there a particular moment or event when you decided to work in support of Ukraine?
Well, part of my background is my father and his entire family actually were born and raised in Kyiv in Ukraine. So support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian country has always had a near and dear place to my heart. Obviously, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and even prior to Maidan, millions of Americans like myself were truly inspired by the Ukrainian people's willingness and ability to push for a free, democratic, and prosperous society. So like many Americans, I was inspired to support Ukraine and actively advocate for Ukraine as well. As the situation kind of shifted within the Republican Party and support for Ukraine dropped within the Republican Party, I felt that it was incumbent on me, not only as someone who was a strong and passionate Republican, but also someone with a Ukrainian heritage and background who cares deeply about this issue, to try to effectuate change outside of the party, to lobby and advocate to Republicans and conservatives about issues related to Ukraine. And I think specifically, a turning point for me to make this transition from working in government to working outside the government was the passage of the last April supplemental. This was a very important piece of legislation that did receive a majority of Republican support, but more and more I noticed that pro-Russian narratives and anti-Ukrainian narratives were taking root and hold in the Republican Party, and that was a moment for me where I knew I had to step out from the outside of the government and work full-time to advocate on Ukraine's behalf.
And can you tell me more about Razom organization? In few words, what do you do?
Absolutely. So Razom for Ukraine is one of the largest advocacy organizations for Ukraine in the United States. We were founded originally in 2014 after the Maidan Revolution, and primarily our focus was on humanitarian work in Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion in 2022, our organization thought it was incredibly important to found an advocacy organization specifically focused on advocating to U.S. lawmakers and policymakers about why support for Ukraine is important and why a strong U.S. bilateral relationship is not only important for Ukraine, but also the United States as well.
And how does your experience working with politicians, especially Republicans, help you at Razom?
Absolutely. So I think in my role at Razom as an advocacy associate and as a registered lobbyist with Razom is to consistently meet with members of Congress on Capitol Hill, their staff, people in the broader public policy community in general. And as someone who was on the receiving end of a lot of these meeting requests, from my perspective, I know what makes an effective meeting, what makes an ineffective meeting, and what messages really resonate with conservative voters. From my personal experience about when groups came and met with me, what kind of motivated me to, really take side with them on their issues, and also, urge my member of Congress and my boss to also support their issues as well.
Good. And what are the biggest challenges in advocating for Ukraine in the United States right now after Trump becomes president?
Sure. I think the biggest challenges right now is trying to keep this issue as bipartisan as possible. Bipartisanship is incredibly important for maintaining strong U.S. levels of support for Ukraine. The reason is because the United States, as you are well aware, is a two-party system, and more often than not, every 2 years when we have an election, at least control of at least one chamber of Congress, and every 4 years sometimes the White House changes from party to party. So it's important to maintain broad bipartisan support. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is a divide within the Republican Party about support for Ukraine, and similarity, perhaps, some Democrats who want to take the issue of Ukraine and turn it into a partisan issue for themselves.
And I also wanted to ask, do you see a difference in attitude towards Ukraine between the old Republican establishment and the new wave of politicians associated with Trump?
Well, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of changes within the Republican platform and what the Republican coalition is since the rise of Donald Trump. I think especially traditional Republicans and older Republicans have a view and memory of the Cold War in the back of their minds and understand that Russia at one point posed a threat to the United States. I also think that, within the broader domestic issues, you are seeing big disagreements between how traditional Republicans and kind of the new right view a number of issues, including economics, including trade, and including how the Republican Party should handle some social issues as well.
And what about help for Ukraine? Like this new wave of politicians is just softer to Russia?
I think overall there is a view, a broader ideological view that the new right hold about what should America's place in the world be. And how America should choose to lead the world. I think after the war on terror and the long wars that we've had in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a fatigue among a number of voters, particularly on the right and among Republicans, for U.S. involvement and engagement abroad. And unfortunately, this broader ideological sentiment of making America less active on the world stage has put support for Ukraine in the crosshairs of that.
And how do you assess the level of support for Ukraine among Republicans now?
I still think that support among Ukraine for Republicans is strong. Recently, what Razom for Ukraine did is we conducted a national poll of Republican voters who voted in the last election to really understand what are their views on Ukraine and specifically what messages really work to move Republicans on Ukraine. What we found was although it's still a divisive issue within the Republican Party, an overwhelming majority of Republicans understand two basic facts and realities. One, Vladimir Putin is not a friend to the United States. And Republicans love Donald Trump as much as they hate Vladimir Putin. And two, an overwhelming majority of Republicans understand the basic truth that this war was started unprovoked by Russia and do not buy into sort of the larger narratives we see from some on the right that this has something to do with NATO enlargement.
Why don't they say this louder? Their opinions and their disagreement maybe with Trump's policies? Are they afraid before the next elections?
Well, I think it's a mixture of a number of things. I think, one, a lot of Republican politicians felt that they haven't had to make a real political choice on Ukraine since their vote in the last supplemental. And as the last election was dominated by domestic issues related to immigration and economy, a lot of Republicans have chosen to sort of focus on that as well. Another concern that a lot of Republicans have as well is the upcoming 2026 elections. And specifically in a lot of their cases, what it will look like in the primary elections or elections that happen within the party prior to the general election as well. And the concern is that a lot of Republicans have is that if they kind of go against what Donald Trump is doing, they could face consequences for this at the ballot box as well. However, as we all know, after the passage of the April supplemental, every single Republican that voted to support Ukraine aid successfully won their primary election.
And how do you, in Razom organization, work with Republicans that don't support Ukraine right now?
Well, the best antidote, I think, is always advocacy. And what we always try to provide to even those Republicans that are skeptical is an open, honest conversation about what's happening to Ukraine and really taking their concerns serious and at face value. While I think there are some skeptical Republicans who may hold some pro-Putin sentiments, this is a very small group. And typically the criticism we hear about support from Ukraine comes from genuine concerns that they have about the level of oversight of the aid, about if the money is being used in the most effective way, and if the European allies are doing their fair share to step up to support Ukraine. All of these are arguments and conversations that we can have in good faith. So not only do we work to provide educational tools, but we also have done our own research through our polling to find out which messages have the most impact and effect on Republicans. And we find broadly that two messages have the biggest effect in swaying skeptics of Ukraine Republican voters to support Ukraine. One are issues related to human rights. We found in our polling that when you tell skeptical Republicans and educate them on the fact of the issue of the Ukrainian kidnapped children, a large majority of them actually said that this would make them more likely to support Ukraine. And same with issues as it relates to the persecution of evangelical Christians in the occupied territories. The other message that we found that was really effective in swaying Republican voters as well is framing support for Ukraine as leverage for Donald Trump to use to negotiate the best deal possible. When Republicans believe and understand that additional weapons, aid, and support for Ukraine allows Donald Trump to bring Putin to the table to negotiate a peace deal, they're much more willing and much more likely to support giving additional arms and aid to Ukraine.
And do you have any stories about changing a politician's stance on Ukraine?
Well, I can share to you a story that our public engagement team engaged with during the last supplemental vote. So while I'm on the government affairs team that primarily focuses on lobbying in Washington, we have an excellent public engagement team whose job is to go around the country, specifically to a lot of these communities that tend to vote Republican, that tend to have MAGA leanings, and try to build a stronger connection between those local communities and between Ukraine. Obviously, during the last supplemental, a key politician that was critical to passing that supplemental was Speaker Mike Johnson, and our public engagement team spent a lot of time in his home community of Shreveport building up relationships with his constituents and members of his local community by bringing Ukraine to them. And once his own constituency saw those connections and were able to reach Mike Johnson, we were able to have a lot of success in being able to push the supplemental across and over the finish line after Speaker Johnson allowed it to proceed to the House floor.
And how important is to engage with Americans, just usual people, in supporting Ukraine? What campaigns or initiatives are you working on in this regard?
Absolutely. Well, ultimately, the American people determine who their politicians are, and the politicians are very reactive to what their people are saying. So based on our prior messaging, we're launching a massive campaign to educate the public about the issue related to the kids. We've been able to successfully get ads in the New York Post, which is a conservative newspaper and Donald Trump's favorite newspaper, as well as run ads on Fox and Friends as well, highlighting the issue of the kids. Other things that we've been doing is bringing Ukrainian voices to Washington to not only, share what is needed to support for Ukraine right now, but also share their personal stories and how the Ukrainian people have been able to persevere for, almost 3 years of this really brutal, brutal war. And I think what really moves the American people and Republican voters in particular is really hearing those personal stories that Ukrainians are willing to come and share.
You also said to me earlier that people who support Ukraine are historically Republican voters, right? Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, I would say that Republican voters and the traditional Republican voters have followed the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan, which has always been very hawkish on the Russians, as you know, and also have a broader idea and understanding of what American leadership in the world is. You actually saw within the first Trump administration a number of positive steps made towards Ukraine, including the delivery of Javelin missiles, which were critical for Ukraine, and additional sanctions on Russia as well. So even going back as far as the Trump first term, you have a coalition of kind of traditional and historical Republicans, and even those on the MAGA side, who are not only very supportive and want to see Ukraine succeed, but truly understand the threat that Russia poses to American leadership around the world.
And you're also from North Carolina, mm-hmm. and it was a swing state
Absolutely.
During the elections. How do people there now see Trump's policies towards Ukraine?
Well, I think North Carolina is a very interesting state in particular, and did end up voting for Trump in the previous 3 elections where he was on the ballot. So although it is a swing state, it does have a conservative constituency. I think from what I've been hearing in the swing state from different colleagues and people that I know, family and friends, there is a wide range of views on currently Donald Trump and how they've been handling the situation. What I can say is that people who voted for Donald Trump, I think, voted for peace, not surrender. And this has been the consistent term that I've been hearing from Republican friends and colleagues and those in North Carolina, that they do want to see a peace. They do agree with President Trump that there needs to be a diplomatic end to the solution, but they also believe that this cannot be a surrender. And if you look at the previous Biden administration, a tipping point within the Biden admin from when they started off from being popular to when they started losing popularity was the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was in which individuals were able to point at Biden and point to this weakness. And this was very effective, a very effective way Republicans were able to take back control in 2024.
And how do you see now support for Ukraine among Republican voters? Is going down or up after Trump's policies, like recently? Because on one hand, I see Republican voters advocating for Ukraine, as you say, but on the other hand, some data suggests a decline in support among Republican voters.
Well, I think it's clear since the beginning of the invasion, we have seen a decline in Republican support for Ukraine. What I will say now is, especially with the recent meeting with the press conference between Trump and Zelensky, Republican voters unfortunately have a much more negative view of Zelensky, and I think that might have shifted some Republican support in a negative direction. However, like I mentioned before, an overwhelming majority of Republican voters still see Russia as an enemy and as an adversary, and an overwhelming majority of Republican voters understand that this war was started unprovoked. So while in the short term, I think there has been a negative direction in terms of Republican support, the overwhelming base of support still exists. And I think if you message these issues in the right way and talk about issues that Republicans care about, it will put us on a long-term trajectory to see Republican support for Ukraine increase.
I also heard an opinion that Republican voters changed their mind about Ukraine because of Trump's policy and because of things that Trump says. What do you think about that? And could it be worsened in the future?
Well, I think there's always a possibility, unfortunately, for things to get worse. I will say that Donald Trump holds a large sway over the Republican Party, but also Donald Trump represents a vast coalition of Republican voters and the American electorate as well. While I can't speak for what every individual Republican voter feels or what may have changed their mind on Ukraine, I think part of the perception is a successful narrative pushed by the opponents of Ukraine and at times Russian disinformation campaigns to paint a negative portrayal of Ukraine as both a country that is weak and corrupt as well. And I think those successful narratives have done far more damage in terms of Republican support for Ukraine than anything that Donald Trump individually has said.
And can you tell me more about this points that about this Russian narratives in the United States?
Sure. So I think there's a number of framings that we often see from a Russian standpoint that have made their way into the conversation in the United States about Ukraine. Prominently, there has been a pushing of issues related to the persecution of the Russian Orthodox Church within Ukraine without understanding the nuances there. I think certain narratives about corruption within Ukraine have also become very salient as well. And in particular, stories that are manufactured about the misuse of money and Ukrainians using the money for purposes outside of weapons as well. If you look at Tucker Carlson as a prime example, building the narrative that Ukrainian weapons are being sold to other countries as well. I mean, we can find a lot of these origins of these conspiracy theories and stories from Russian disinformation and Russian propaganda. And through a really clever and wide ecosystem that they have, they've been able to insert that narrative into the American conversation.
Yeah, and Russia has a really huge and effective propaganda. How can we as Ukrainians or our leaders or our activists fight these narratives and this Russian propaganda ourselves?
Absolutely. I think one is being present. It is so important for Ukrainian voices to be loud and active and countering Russian disinformation as much as possible. Two, I think it's educating Americans on the realities of what's happening in Ukraine and the country. A lot of Americans have never left the country in their lives, and a lot of Americans don't prioritize foreign policy as a way that they vote as well, and that means they don't oftentimes track a lot of what's going on. So the antidote to disinformation is always education, in my view.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it. You answered all of my questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for your insights and for the important work that you do. I hope your efforts continue to bring results for Ukraine. And thank you very much for watching. It was Daniel Vaynshteyn, an advocacy associate at Razom organization. We were talking about advocacy for Ukraine in the United States. And my name is Maria Kahal. Thank you for watching.